to introduce our first ministerial candidate before you, Reverend Andy. Throughout the whole process, we had 18 candidates, but throughout the whole thing, we were all so drawn to the heart of Andy. And a lot of what he had to share in our many interviews and talking with him back and forth, and I had the privilege of being his key contact. And I can just tell you that he is a man that I admire just for that process and what we went through. So it's my privilege to introduce our first ministerial candidate before the congregation, Reverend Andy Torkelson. He's the pastor at the Center for Spiritual Living in Paradise. He's been there as a pastor for 7 years. He's ordained. And so just sit back and enjoy Andy and get to know him as he shares his heart. Thank you. Reverend Andy.
Hello? How many points did I get for that? I can turn on a microphone. First of all, I want to say I want to thank you for your warm welcome, and I want to say that I'm really humbled to be here. I've admired this center very much for many years. The foundation it was built upon, and Charlie has been really great to me, and the whole process. I've been treated with complete respect and honored, but also everyone who was a part of that committee, it was very obvious how much they love this center, how much they love all of you. And so it's been a wonderful process. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for having me here. Thank you. Today is my daughter's birthday. She's 30, way too old something. And I got up really early this morning and I text her happy birthday. She lives in the Houston area. It's an interesting time we live in. And I was thinking about my daughter this morning. I was thinking about a conversation that we had some years ago, a conversation that was not a very easy conversation. I was married. Once upon a time, I had a marriage and I had 3 children, and that was a very troubled marriage. Very troubled because I think I was very troubled. The person I was married to was very troubled. It was an interesting time of life, to put it lightly. And it's really hard when you're going through a difficult time in your life and you know it. And you are not being the husband or the father, the parent that you want to be. And you know that within your home there's a lot of dysfunction and unhealthy things going on. And I remember when my kids were little, they're all in their 30s now. I remember when we would go places, public places. We'd go to a mall, we'd go to a soccer game, we'd go to a Little League game. And I would look around and I would see those families that appeared to me to be happy, appeared to me to be healthy. And I would wonder what it would be like to live in their home, to be part of their family. And I wonder what it would be like to be raising your kids in the environment you would really love to raise them in and to experience that. The reason I was thinking about my daughter this morning is because a few years ago, she and I had a very honest conversation, and she shared with me that she used to do the same thing. And so we shared that common ground. And fortunately, there came a time in my life where I made some changes and I was able to put together a home that was a much better place for my children as they got older. But it was interesting that we shared this conversation. You see, sometimes, we have this ideal of home. And some people have had wonderful homes and loving homes, and some people haven't. And some people grew up in loving homes, and some people didn't. But what's interesting to me is that there is this ideal that we as human beings have of what that feels like, what it looks like, to feel safe, to feel loved. What is home? Home is that place where you can go and you can relax, you can take your shoes off, you can be understood. You can share a history. You can feel safe. You can feel that the shadows are sort of held at bay. You can feel that things are going to be worked out. Things are going to be okay. You can share laughter. You can share tears. That's the ideal of home. And I think it's an ideal that we all carry around inside of us. I think we come into this world with this idea. There's a really sweet story in the Old Testament of the Bible about a gentleman by the name of Nehemiah. It's in the book that's named after him. And Nehemiah was a really good metaphysician. Nehemiah was not living in his home. He was not living in his country. He was enslaved. He was taken out of his home. And the thing that's really sweet about this story of Nehemiah is the book starts, when you read the book, with this, how much he loved home. He was in servitude and he was away from his home, but how much he loved it. He thought about the walls and the streets, and he thought about the people, he thought about the cemeteries, he thought about the parks, and it was a place where he felt all those feelings that I said before. But he was in servitude, and I say he was a good metaphysician because even though he was away from home, he didn't live in a place of being really resentful and nasty about it. In fact, the person he worked for a member of the royal family in the land that he was kept in. And he was such a nice person. He was such an optimistic and upbeat person that the person of royalty who he worked with just loved him. He loved him like a brother. He loved him like a family member. He would do anything for him. And I think that Nehemiah was also a great metaphysician because he held the ideal in his mind. We can say that he wished to be home. He desired to be home. His intention was to be in home. And even though he was so loving and so wonderful and so decent to everyone around him, he still held that ideal. And I think that that's the place that he was grounded, that he knew that there was something bigger and greater for him, that place called home, that place that he belonged. So one day he ran into a fellow countryman who had come from his home, and this is the Old Testament, so there's a lot of melodrama, there's a lot of backstabbing and politics and war and bloodshed. The Old Testament of the Bible is kind of like a blockbuster movie nowadays. It's just got special effects and everything like that. And so the country he had come from, his home, had gone through that kind of Old Testament stuff. And so he runs into someone who's from his home and he says, "Hey, how's everything going there?" And you wouldn't believe it. They've burned down the walls and they've pillaged and they've come in and they've torn everything apart and there's all these great wars and everything. And so Nehemiah is really saddened because of this. So one day he's waiting on or helping the person who he's a servant to, this royal person. And the royal person notices he's not his usual chipper self, and so he says, "Nehemiah, what's wrong?" And so he shared with him. He said, "Well, I just heard about my home, and it's in disarray, and these people came in and invaded it, and they burned the place down, and they tore the walls down, and they tore the gates down, and they burned the buildings, and they pillaged everything." And so the person he worked for had such love for him that he said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" And see, that's what I mean by Nehemiah being a great metaphysician, because when we step into a place where we want to do something in our lives, we start attracting people to us. We start attracting everything and everyone we need. And the story in Nehemiah is a great story, among other things, of metaphysics. And he said, "Well, if it's okay with you, I would love to go. I would love to see what I can do. I'm just a slave. I don't have a lot going on. I don't have much of a bank account, but I would love to do this. And so again, this royal person says, well, you know what? I'll give you a position. I'll give you some treasury. I'll give you some people to go with you, because you're like my friend. You're like my family. And again, the metaphysician, what's he get? He gets the title. He gets the treasury. He gets people to help him. It all begins to flow to him. So he goes back to the country, and sure enough, it's in disarray. And so he begins to go to work, and he begins to attract all kinds of people to him. And in this country, there were all kinds of divisions within tribes and people not getting along, and there were the people they were having war with, and the people who were in cahoots with them, and the people who were out of cahoots, and all that kind of stuff. Again, it's Old Testament melodrama, right? It's like watching The Godfather or something, So he goes and he begins to make peace. Because with Nehemiah, it's very clear. I just want to have this home restored. I just want to be able to stand in this place where, like what we talked about, I feel relaxed, I feel loved, I feel cared for. And that energy, that idea, when we stand in that place of love, then we begin to attract to us the people who want to stand in that place as well. So the people who are against him, they try all kinds of things. They make war, they make battles, they try and talk him out of things, they try and take him to lunch, they try and reason with him. But Nehemiah, basically, if he were around today, he would basically say, no, I can't be bothered with what you're doing because the work I'm doing is too important. I am doing important work. And he was very clear about that. He was very clear about the idea of what he wanted to achieve. And so, as time went on, he was able to achieve what he set out to achieve. And we know metaphysically the meanings of things. He restored the walls, which is a form of protection. He restored the gates, which is a way of coming in and out. He restored the peace. And he began to pull together this home ideal. He began to construct what he had always wanted. Jack Kornfield, in his book, A Path with Heart, tells the story of when he was a young Buddhist monk, and this is sometime, I think, right after the Vietnam War was over. He went into a Cambodian refugee camp, and of course, what we know is that when that part of the world fell, Vietnam, Cambodia, families were in complete disarray. Some families had people who had died, who were missing. Jack Kornfield talks about going to this refugee camp, and there would be people who would be, these remnants of families. There would be an uncle over here and some kids over there, and there would be a mother without a father, and sometimes half the kids are gone. And so these people were living in this refugee camp in this completely desolate place. It's the driest season of the year. There's no water. It's hot. And all of these families are living, with these pieces of families are living in these huts that are like 4 feet by 6 feet huts. But out in front of each hut, Jack Kornfield said, there was a square yard of earth that they could do whatever they wanted. And he said it was amazing that over time, you began to see these little gardens spring up because the refugees, they would walk about a mile with a bucket down to an open pit well and get water. And they would come back and they created these gardens. He said, so out in front of these huts would be these beautiful little squash growing up or bean plants or these little flowers. And suddenly this entire refugee camp began to flourish, and and green and flowers and things to eat began to come up, and the refugees were trading in between themselves to supplement their diets, and he said it was absolutely wonderful. He looked at the idea that these gardens became so completely important to them, became so completely their focus, that they put in the time and the energy. Like Nehemiah, they basically said, this work I'm doing is important work to restore this home. Because even though families were fractured and they were living in this strange place, to them it was still home. It was the essence where we are as home. And they wanted the same thing. They wanted to relax. They wanted a place to be loved. They wanted a place to be cared for. And they put that energy in there. Jack Kornfield says in his book, he says, when we take the one seat, which is our yoga mat, our own monastery, that place in the midst of it all that is our truth, our ideal on this earth, the great force of life will begin to move through us. A lesson in metaphysics. When we take that place, when we take that focus, when we say, this is home, and I care about it, he says the great force of life begins to come through us. You know, one of the definitions that Ernest Holmes gives love is, he says, love is spirit's giving forth to its creation whatever it needs. Whatever it needs. And so we see in this Cambodian refugee camp, we see this begin to come up. We saw it in the story of Nehemiah, where everything began to come forward through each and every one of us, because that's what we wanted. The question that I have, I look at the times in which we live, and we live in really interesting times. And I look at the idea of what I would call community, what I would call home. And I think the idea of community and home has shifted over, certainly in my lifetime. I look at, I think that what we're called upon is to say, what is it that I want in my spiritual community? What is it that I want in my larger community? What is it that I want in my state? What is it that I want in my country? What is it that I want in my world? And I think that today, we all have to acknowledge that we are being called forth to show up as we never have been before. This earth that we live in, we all know it is literally today calling us forth. How will we show up in terms of bringing forth our love and our dedication? In terms of doing the things that we have to do to bring forward the home that we want. I was thinking about my daughter this morning, because I said that we had a conversation some time ago, where she told me, yeah, when I was a little girl, I used to look at those people, those families that looked like that they loved each other and cared about each other. And I used to wonder what it would be like to be with them. Well, about a year and a half ago, my daughter lives in the Houston area, and she has 2 little kids, my grandchildren. And because she lives in Houston, we don't see a lot of each other, and they're embroiled in their life, and I'm embroiled in my life, and all that sort of thing. So it's a lot of texting and emailing and Facebooking and all that sort of thing. And I got off a plane, and she picked me up at the airport, and she took me to her home, and this beautiful little home in a suburb outside of Houston, and walked into her home, and her kids are running around and they're doing their thing, and my grandson, he's way off into Indiana Jones and Spider-Man and all kinds of stuff, and my granddaughter Emma, she wants to she's got a collection of babies, and she's got a collection of reptiles and all that sort of thing, and she's taking care of everyone, and they're running around doing their thing, and I sat down in her home and spent time with she and her husband and the kids, and they have quite a zoo. They have ferrets and cats and dogs and all kinds of little tiny animals that don't live very long, and they have a cemetery in the backyard. And I remember sitting there. I spent a couple days with her, and I was sitting there one day, and one of the things about a healthy family is the raucousness of it, and everyone doing their own thing, and everyone feeling safe enough to do that and loved enough to do that. And I thought to myself, I was so proud of her because she had made one of those families. She had made that home. She had now made a home that when she was a little girl, she wished she had been in. And I told her that. I told her just how proud I am of her for that. I believe that we live in a time where we are family. We are family. I remember reading somewhere where in Afghanistan, or it was either Iraq or Afghanistan, I think it was Iraq, a soldier was on patrol, and it was one of those things, chasing people through yards and alleys and stuff like that, to, whatever. Got all the stuff on, got the automatic weapon, got everything going on. Exchanging gunfire, us and them, the good guys, the enemy, the black hats, the white hats, all that stuff. This young man breaks down the front door of like a dwelling, an apartment, a small house of some kind, going through, chasing somebody, ready to just pull the trigger on whatever moves, breaks in another door, and he finds himself in a kitchen. And he stops and he looks around the kitchen. And he said at that moment, it could have been my grandmother's kitchen. The dish rack, the towels, the plastic chairs around the table. He said, there was no way I could pull a trigger on anybody. We are being called to think about this idea of home, what home is. And that we can have any kind of home that we want. Because when you follow this teaching, it simply says that once we set our intention, then we can make it so. Like what Jack Kornfield said when he said, the great force of life comes through us. And again, I go back full circle to when I first came up here and saying, I have always been so moved by the home that you have created here. I would appreciate it if you would join me in the consciousness of prayer. Coming together in a prayerful consciousness, I recognize that God is truly all there is. And I know that God is here because we are here. And I know that as we move forward into the home of our lives, that Spirit's power enables us to create whatever it is, to bring forward whatever that may be. And I am so grateful for that. I know that the love of Spirit is truly with us each and every moment as it expresses through us. And I know and declare I know and declare that where that desire and that intention wells up for a beautiful, healthy, loving home, I know that Spirit is there, showing the way. So in my gratitude for all of this, I let my word go, knowing that it's so, and so it is. Namaste. Thank you.